Sandberg is a researcher, science debater, futurist, transhumanist, and author. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University, and he is currently a James Martin Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. And now I will add, it's the only, one of the few transhumanist people I know who is able to speak about all fields of transhumanism without preparation almost. And now I let him speak for 22 minutes and 22 seconds.
Thank you very much. So this talk was indeed kind of improvised together. What should I talk about? And I'm happy to see that I can find some links to the previous two talks this morning. So this is perhaps going to be a bit more of an inside perspective of somebody who's been very much embedded in transhumanism for a very long time. And I also started out by thinking about this as a bit more of a popular talk, kind of, if somebody haven't come to this field from before, didn't know a transhumanist, well, how could one explain what we are trying to do at our institute? And of course, being a neuroscientist, I like to start with brains. Like zombies, neuroscientists love brains. And I usually show this slide and ask people which brain is the chimpanzee brain and which brain is the human brain. And it's very simple because most of us can read. But if we couldn't read, very few people in the room would probably have an easy time figuring out which was which, because they actually look fairly similar. The difference between the chimpanzee brain and the human brain is not that tremendous. Yes, we have larger brains, but all the basic systems are exactly the same, and it actually goes down fairly long time back. Among the mammals, most mammalian brains look roughly the same. Yes, a mouse brain is a smooth, small thing the size of a pea, but the same subsystems, the same connectivity exists there. It's just that we have developed more areas, we have gotten more flexibility. And even that small difference between the chimpanzee and human makes all the difference. Our common ancestors 6 million years ago lived roughly like chimpanzees do today. Hunting and gathering in the forest, avoiding predators, and that was it. And then we diverged. Our branch ended up on the savannah, and because of various reasons we do not still fully understand, ended up being an intelligent species, or at least slightly smarter than chimps, able to communicate, able to have a cumulative culture, good with our ability to predict the physical consequences of action, which allows us not just to make tools, but save tools, teach each other to make tools, store tools, use the tools to reshape our environment, and suddenly we found in all ecological zones of Earth, from the oceans to the polar regions. Meanwhile, the chimpanzees, they are still in their forest. Except that the forests are now started to turn rather small. There are metal birds flying around the sky. The predators are getting scarce. There are these weird hairless monkeys around with sticks that go bang, and that seems to have something to do with the number of predators getting scared. But the chimpanzees can't even tell that something has changed because they haven't got history. They haven't got historians. And indeed, they don't even know that the fate of their species is now totally in our hands. It's all dependent on what we do in terms of environmental conservation. So normally at this point I can get over, of course, in a discussion of the role of intelligence, and this is partially why we at our institute are working very much on understanding superintelligence and why that could actually be a threat. Because even if a small difference of intelligence can be done by brains relatively similar, if we get vastly better forms of brains, that might change the world even more, which might mean that we are going to be like the chimps in a smaller and smaller forest and subjected to something else that we don't even understand that is running the story. But there is another way of looking at this, and that is, of course, historically. So here is a plot of the world population of the last 12,000 years with a bit of extrapolation. And on this kind of diagram, of course, it looks like a typical hockey stick graph. Then not very much is happening up until about a few thousand years ago when agriculture really gets going. And then we get the Industrial Revolution and then things really get going. And one can, of course, make diagrams of all kinds like this. So here is a similar looking graph, but in this case, it's wealth per person in Britain over roughly the past 800 years. And again, you have this very strong exponential growth. Some noise, of course, but generally we're getting ridiculously wealthy after the Industrial Revolution really gets going, and it really starts happening after the last few decades. And one can, of course, play around by gathering more and more graphs like this. Our World in Data that I got this from is a wonderful Oxford project trying to get as much objective statistical data about the current state and the past state of the world. Here is Luke Mulhauser's combination of several graphs. So this is extremely apples and orange comparison. So one of them is life expectancy and how that's been going on, the light blue graph, which up until recently didn't increase at all. Another one is wealth. And then the green one is percentage not living in extreme poverty. One can quibble about the definition of extreme poverty, but again, things are really changing. Also, of course, we've got energy capture. How much of the world, the ecosphere are we actually controlling and making use of? And we can plot things like democracy. Luke's point here was actually across human history, the Industrial Revolution has been a very, very unique thing. Another point he made was all these red things, many of them represent very bad events. They represent genocides, enormous wars, falls of civilizations. And they didn't actually change the graph that much. It's not like we got these tremendous bumps. The fall of the Roman Empire did probably produce what we can honestly call a dark age for at least a few centuries. But it's relatively short term compared to a lot of it. Also, of course, one can add these graphs and note that not all of these curves are nice. We have, for example, war-making capacity, which I don't remember how we calculated, but we certainly have an ability to destroy much more people per minute than ever before, which is not necessarily a good thing to have. And of course, it's very easy to gather more and more graphs like this. We have all sorts of ecological graphs, and we can make a good argument that, yeah, we're living in Anthropocene. We're kind of running this planet. Not very well, but it's pretty clear that we're now a major geological force. We're actually fixating more nitrogen now than the soil bacteria have done. And we haven't known how to fixate nitrogen for more than a century. It took billions of years for bacteria to figure it out. So this is, of course, an argument, not necessarily that we're living at the pivotal point of history. Because if you have an exponential graph, you're always going to be at the point that it's growing the fastest, at the point where you see it. It might level off eventually, but we don't know when. But we certainly know that things are changing very rapidly, and we certainly know that many of the processes here are, if not unsustainable, at least indicative that we're going to change the rules of the game quite tremendously. And of course, this then puts us in a bit of a quandary, because we actually know that we don't know how to do this well. We are a bit like the monkey in the high voltage cabinet, thinking something is problematic here. I wonder what I should do. I wonder if I should touch that one or not. Maybe that's the door handle, maybe that's a high voltage line. And many of our problems are, of course, our own making. So if we look back historically, of course, we know from our family tree that species like ours have gone extinct in the past. We have a lot of sibling and cousin species, and they went extinct. Some for natural resources, some for natural reasons. Some of them we might have a suspicion that our ancestors might have had a hand in it. And we also have reason to believe that our species could have been one of the unlucky skulls out there. So this is Lake Toba in Indonesia. About 80,000 years ago, this volcano had a big eruption, and according to a mildly controversial theory, it actually created a genetic bottleneck in the past of our species. Probably only a few thousand individuals survived, if this theory is right. Basically, the eruption caused a temporary change in climate, lasting a few decades, that made most of our ancestors starve to death. We could have been a bit unlucky if that eruption had been a bit more larger. And of course, there are closer things. We of course have Stanislav Petrov, who was a great hero. Unfortunately, died early this year. Who in 1983, on 26th of September, did not press the button. The reason we can sit here and talk and have a wonderful life is that this man, actually, when the Soviet missile detection systems believed that the Americans had launched a preemptive attack, decided to trust his skepticism and not make the call, which would most likely have led to a retaliatory attack, and then the Northern Hemisphere would be in a nuclear winter. Now, he succeeded in that, but there was a lot of similarly bad close calls during the Cold War. As various archives have been opened, we have many, many frightening histories about these risks. I think most of you are familiar with this concept of existential risk. Basically, the idea is that there are some risks that we can only have once. If they happen, the severity is going to be crushing us or ending us. And they have pan-generational effects. They affect all generations, probably by preventing them from coming into being. So most of existential risk people talk about are extinction risks, threats that just could kill us. We can also imagine things like an eternal dictatorship as an existential risk. Humanity survives, but the future is a boot stamping on a human face forever. And thanks to modern surveillance technologies and other things, it can actually do that forever. We can imagine various forms of degeneration, that we do some foolish things that crushes our civilization and prevent us from ever regaining our abilities. So much of our research is about existential risk. And there is a good reason to care about it. The loss of value in existential risk is not just about 7.2 or 3 billion people would be killed if it happened today. It also means that all future generations would not come to exist. And depending on your ethical theory, this might be more or less bad. But to many ethical theories, this is actually really bad, because just as we shouldn't discriminate against people who live far away in space, after all, somebody in India is worth just as much as I am, as your neighbor in this room is, morally speaking. Why should we then say that somebody a century into the future is worth less than us? Yeah, we don't know them, but just like I don't know that hypothetical person in India, but we certainly exist, or rather, they will exist if we survive. Now, others disagree on this, so there is some interesting debate about the value of future generation. But different value theories reach generally conclude the same thing. The future matters a lot, because also many of our projects are only meaningful if there is a future. Our savings for the future, making art, building cathedrals, a lot of that is about preferences about how the world further on will be. If you do, very few projects are meaningful if you just assume that they will be wiped out instantly. There is even an interesting question whether there could be a value to a species itself. This is not terribly popular in philosophy today, except of course in ecological philosophy, where many people argue that different species actually have an inherent value. It's wrong to wipe out the chimpanzees because that species has an inherent value, regardless of whether it's good for a chimpanzee to be around. If one accepts that, then obviously Homo sapiens has some form of value we need to safeguard. There might even be a thing that we are the only real conscious observers in the universe, the only beings that actually properly evaluate the world. I don't completely agree with this theory, but it's a possibility. In that case, if we go extinct or lose our ability to be conscious, then value might be lost from the universe completely. So this, the consideration together suggests that existential risk is super bad and enormously worth stopping. Now, as an aside here, at the TransVision in Paris a few years back, there was a really nice talk about where has the happy cyborg gone. So the speaker, and unfortunately I can't recall her name, pointed out that a lot of 90s transhumanism was all very optimistic. It was all about how we are going to upgrade ourselves, take cognitive enhancing drugs, cyborg ourselves, and go off and live happily ever after in space. And she was noticing that then there is a lot more pessimism, and she was kind of almost bemoaning the fact that transhumanists have become so pessimistic. And I think there is an interesting point in that. I think it's actually important to recognize the interplay between optimism and pessimism in transhumanism. And that what I want to do in this talk is to actually give a kind of answer to the question. Actually, the reason why we care about dark things like this is that we're real optimists. If we were pessimists, we would say, yeah, we're doomed. Let's bring out the wine. because nothing else will work. And they're trying to fix this. Oh, that's never going to work. If you're an optimist, you say, oh, there is value at stake, a lot of value. And also, we might actually have a chance to fix things. The pessimist doesn't really believe things are fixable. So that is why I think that it's telling that the world of existential risk research is very much coming from the transhumanist movement. Certainly people have been interested in apocalyptic scenarios before, but mostly as a cultural story, or as in the case of nuclear war or environmental degradation, as disasters in their own right. But seeing them as examples of a general threat to humanity, a general field where many different kinds of risks come together, that is somewhat unique that originated among transhumanists. And that is partly because we believe the future can be much more extreme than most people believe normally the future would be. If you think the future is just going to be a bit of flying cars and a little bit more pollution, then of course existential risk is not really thinkable. If you start thinking that the future could be a radically enhanced world, then by symmetry you should imagine that the future could also be radically disenhanced or destroyed. So it's more natural as a transhumanist to think about these things than for many people who claim that the future is going to be fairly normal. If you think the future is normal, then of course it can't be wiped out. Now, I think I'm not going to bore you too much by getting into all the wonderful and horrifying and fascinating kinds of risk. I can obviously go on for hours about this. We have astronomical risks, which generally produce wonderful pictures. And many of them are not much problems. Supernovas probably hit the Earth every 100 million years or so and might cause mass extinction if you're really unlucky. But we don't have any stars like that nearby. Eta Carina, which is probably the most spectacular explosion to happen in the near future, is 8,000 light years away, and it's apparently pointed in the wrong direction. So we're safe. We should probably individually be much more worried about solar eruptions. Things like the Carrington event in the 1850s wiped out the telegraph grid, which was way more robust than our power grids and the internet. And if it happened today, we would be in trouble. So this is an interesting practical problem we might want to work on. Asteroid impacts certainly happen and are certainly spectacular. But again, the big impacts that threaten civilization are relatively rare. Probably over the next century, we're going to get much more news because our radar observations of asteroids almost hitting Earth or actually about to hit Earth are going to improve. So we're going to get reports that, oh, in 10 hours, a 10-meter asteroid is going to hit somewhere in Europe, which probably will not harm anybody, but you can't really be certain. That's going to cause some interesting things about how you alarm the public and what the rational response to these small risks are. Then, of course, we have got the geophysical risks. And again, by being widely dispersed, we are not really threatened that much anymore by hurricanes, tsunamis, and earthquakes. Many other species are localized in one spot on Earth are vulnerable to that. We're mostly vulnerable to things that could change the climate system and especially agriculture. So right now, of course, we got the issue of climate change. In the long run, we will have to deal with the end of the interglacial we're living in. We're in an ice age, and there should, on average, there should be a few 100 meters of ice on top of this place. Might be bad for agriculture, certainly bad for cafes. Supervolcanoes also happen every few 100,000 years and also cause temporary disruptions which would wipe out our agriculture. But again, every few 100,000 years is not much of a probability.
We have some news on...
We can discuss that later, yeah. Another risk Mother Nature is throwing at us is, of course, natural pandemics, which are rather nasty things. The Black Death reshaped Europe. Okay, I need to speed up. Wait. Okay, and it can wipe out frogs and influenza and so on. And the real problem, actually, is, of course, the risks we generate to ourselves. And again, I'm totally running out of time. I can go on forever. But the interesting part here is, of course, we transhumanists play a particular role in that we're interested in emerging technologies and the risk they impose. Some of these risks are hypothetical so far. Nobody has really been harmed by artificial intelligence except by being squished by an industrial robot, but we can foresee various problematic applications. proving that particle accelerator can't make black holes, strangelets, or vacuum decay that destroy the world is actually surprisingly hard. And physicists were surprisingly complacent about this risk until forced by paranoid people to actually explain it. And we certainly are about to get into a biotechnology revolution, which is going to make it much easier to make rather scary things relatively easily. And there are many other interesting topics here, which are very close to our transhumanist hearts. We care about them. We want the positive side. But given that we also assume they will change the world, we should expect that we could also change the world for worse, which means that we actually have both an incentive to try to figure out what the risks are and what to do about it, without preventing us from getting the good stuff. We want to have an internet without distributed denial of the service attacks. We want to have artificial superintelligence that is value aligned with us humans so we can survive together with it. We want to understand the outer fringes of physics without accidentally poking a hole in the universe. We want to find ways of boosting our intelligence and minds without accidentally finding means of mass propaganda or ways of crashing minds. So, to sum up the existential risk thing, what we know today is basically nature is not a problem. There is risk there. Some of them are hard to deal with, but the probability is much smaller than the risk we cause to ourselves. Many of these risks are systemic too. We have created big systems that are unstable in various ways. And the technological risks are tricky because they don't exist yet in many cases, but we also have a much better chance of controlling them. Except, of course, that controlling a technology that doesn't exist yet and we don't fully understand is always going to be harder than handling something else. But there are also ways of fixing this and improving our chance of surviving it. So I'm just going to very briefly run through this argument that boosting just our technology is going to fix some risks. But we also want better coordination because many of the risks come from having powerful technology without coordination. We also want to have better insight about what we actually need to do. The real problem here is, of course, that just boosting insight, that might render us impotent. We might know what we should do, but can't do it. Boosting a coordination can actually be sometimes very dangerous. It's good to have diversity of opinions. Sometimes everybody needs to work together, but quite often, if everybody is forced to work together, we might actually miss out on solutions. Navigating the right mixture here is actually a very non-trivial problem on its own. And there are various forms of solutions. Again, totally not having any time to get into this, but perfect for question session. One obvious thing is more research is actually needed because the value of new information is quite important. Setting our priorities right is very important. Typically, the most important thing you can do is an order of magnitude more important than the second most important thing. So if your priorities are even slightly out of order, you might be missing most of the value. And reducing our biases, etc., these things can really improve our decision making. We can actually develop systems that can prevent the risks and handle that. And then there is this interesting thing that we can try to avoid creating risk. People like saying, oh, we should ban dangerous technology or relinquish dangerous technology or have a moratorium. It sounds so cool, especially because moratorium is a cool, fancy word, except that in practice it rarely works. Most moratoria are very temporary things. It only works if nobody really wants the thing. What you probably want to do is making sure that you put in the right safeguards. Or you go for something positive. We can change the order when technology arrives. In general, if something can be done, somebody will eventually do it. But if most of us want a technology that makes other technology safe, we can push the arrival date of that technology earlier. So I do think that we can work on differential technology development. We can try to foresee some of these risks and see what we do about it. Biotechnology poses various risks, so we should get better global ways of detecting new pathogens. And we know that superintelligence could be risky, so we might develop AI safety methods before we get to superintelligence. We know quantum computers are going to wreck various forms of computer security, so let's make quantum safe encryption before that. This is a positive approach rather than try to ban it. And you can also try to boost the creativity. Even without knowing what the best solution is, you can fund that kind of approach. We might also want to get out of risky states. We might want to find technologies that get us out of the current. And of course, we can boost our resilience. Some of that is just sensible things, like if we're a richer world, we have more resources to handle. If we actually trust each other well, we actually can work together more effectively. In some cases, there might be specific solutions. David Denkenberger has done a brilliant work on proving that, yeah, in principle, we could feed everybody if agriculture was impossible for 10 years. Basically, by finding other sources of nutrients and turning it into human digestible nutrients, mostly wood and other biomass, and literally converting them using mushrooms, insects, and other ways. This works very well as an engineering sketch on paper. It actually needs to be fleshed out as an actual program that we want to have, not to use, but want to have around in the case of a nuclear winter, asteroid impact, or supervolcano. Funding that kind of research would probably give us quite a lot of safeguards. There are interesting ways of trying to boost our defense against replication. We might want to spread out. Some people like the idea of hiding in a bunker for existential risk. Others would suggest that it's natural to spread to space. And of course, if we could do brain emulations, and at least some people are software, they would be immune to biological risk, even though they, of course, now would be vulnerable to power breakdowns and computer viruses. But you separate the risks, you can decorrelate risk. So in general, I think our options are basically, we have essentially 4 options, and I don't believe in 2 of them. Extinction is always possible. You could imagine some disaster that brings us down to a permanently low level and we'd never get out of. That is somewhat unlikely, I think. I think it requires some very weird things. We might stay as hunter-gatherers for a long time, but I do think eventually people will reinvent technology. What I definitely don't believe in is that some things will stay the same forever. That we're all going to live in little idyllic towns and roughly like this and never go transhuman in any way. Because forever is a very long time. Yes, I can imagine 1,000 years of backwardness where we're all very happy to live in little idyllic small towns and being very sustainable. But sooner or later, somebody's going to have an idea. I think the only real long-term solution is actually going up and out. In the long run, obviously, we are going to be dealing with these technologies. And that means that we are most likely going to leave Earth. Probably not because of overpopulation, etc. It's very hard to move a large population into space. Colonizing space is probably always going to be a minority activity. Just like colonizing the Americas was a minority activity. Not a very large fraction did it, but eventually they became a very large population. So I have been working a little bit on thinking about how big is the future, how much can we reach? And that's a sketch of the visible universe, the white stuff. That's the galaxies, superclusters, and voids. Those yellow spheres correspond to how far we could travel at different speeds. And basically, if we could move at light speed, we could get 5 billion parsecs out, 15 billion light years away. Even at more modest speeds, we're talking about literally millions of galaxies within reach. Each galaxy has about 100 billion stars. And, well, if you can live in space, because you can travel there, maybe you have space habitat, you don't even need to live around the planets. In fact, each solar system can sustain literally thousands of trillions of inhabitants, even as biological humans, even without thinking about post-biology, which is way more energy efficient. And of course, this is going to last for the stelliferous era with stars is going to last for about 1 trillion years. After that, you need to really start upgrading your biology to survive. But the future is ridiculously large. The number of future generations, even if you do a modest assumption that, oh, we're going to be hunter-gatherers surviving maybe 100 million of us for 800,000 years like a normal mammalian species, that already means that there is 1 trillion people in the future. And we're risking 1 trillion people if we are risking a nuclear Armageddon right now. If we just expand into the solar system, now we're talking about many, many more orders of magnitude. If we go between the stars, the orders of magnitude pile up. The future becomes tremendously large, tremendously vast, tremendously valuable, because, of course, all these trillions and trillions and trillions of lives would be, hopefully, at least as good as our lives, perhaps vastly much more. And this is why we want to avoid existential risk. This is why we want to set up the right kind of coordination. Now, if you take a non-transhumanist perspective and say, no, we're never going to go to space, we're just going to be living normally, then this enormous value is not around. You might still want to avoid nuclear war because it's scary and might destroy some cathedrals you like, but you don't quite have the same drive as we have. I think we are aware that this is the future that's being risked, and this is what we could gain if we play our cards right. So that is why I argue that, yeah, there is a reason why we worry about existential risk, and that's because we're ridiculously optimistic. Thank you.